Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on what part of the world you're calling in from. My name is Tony Yang. Welcome to my session titled How to Set Up a Buyer Journey Based Lead Scoring Model. Thanks for joining me today. All right, so let me go through a little bit about myself. This is the boring part of the presentation. Basically, I have 16 years total of B2B marketing experience. I started off early in my career working for large companies like IBM and Yahoo, back when Yahoo was sort of a cool brand. But in the last 15 years or so, 14 to 15-ish, give or take, a year or so, I've been working for a number of different tech startups up in Silicon Valley. And some of those startups included a company called Mintigo. This was a Sequoia Capital-backed company in the predictive analytics space for marketing. That company was acquired by Anaplan. I worked for a marketing attribution company. That could be a whole nother topic. I believe there's a session actually on attribution presented on another time slot for this event. And I also worked for another company called Cordova, which is a competitor to Grammarly, and a few other startups here and there. I've been a Marketo Power user for about 10 years now. I also consider myself a competent novice in HubSpot, and I'm also very familiar with Pardot. I actually was one of Pardot's earlier customers back in 2008-ish, 2007, 2008. And fun fact, they actually had a different name for their product called Prospect Insight. So I don't know, maybe some of you guys didn't know that. These days, I am a fractional CMO / marketing consultant. I typically advise and consult for B2B tech startups across different stages, from very, very early stage startups to growth stage that are starting to scale to multiple locations. And I'm also the co-founder of a new technology called RevOptica, which is a buyer journey visualization and analytics platform for B2B revenue teams. So as you can probably tell, I'm someone who gets really excited about buyer journeys. All right, let's just jump right in. All right, so today's agenda, we'll cover these items, and I'll just kind of give you a highlight or overview of what we'll be covering. Number one, why are we talking about lead scoring today? Number two, what I believe a lot of people still get wrong about lead scoring. Then I'll start to introduce the buyer journey decision framework, the one that I specifically use across different companies I work with, and how these frameworks relate to lead scoring. Then I'll talk about conducting a message mapping exercise and a content audit. And I'll explain later on why that's important for lead scoring. Then I'll get into some steps on how to actually set it up, and we'll wrap everything up at the end. Okay, so why are we talking about lead scoring today? I remember back in 2010 when I first started using Marketo and was asked to implement a lead scoring model. I found this guide on their website, Definitive Guide to Lead Scoring. This was back in 2010, people. A couple years afterwards, Josh Hill, who is also a speaker in this event, he used to run the site called Marketing Rockstar Guides. I was an avid reader of his. And I remember coming across his article called How to Build Lead Scoring Systems in Marketo. And this was back in 2012. Fast forward a couple years, 3 years after that, when I was working for Mintigo, I actually authored the piece of content that you see on the right, predictive lead scoring, because Mintigo, we had a use case or solution basically running predictive lead scoring modeling. And so I wrote this guide in conjunction with our partner, Oracle Marketing Cloud, and this was published in 2015. So again, like, why are we still talking about this today? I think there's still an issue or a challenge that a lot of those of us in marketing ops, demand gen, even those of us in sales, I feel like we're still not getting it right. And before I jump to the next slide, I just did a quick Google Trends search on lead scoring, dating back all the way to 2010. You could see that the trend line is still going up and to the right. With, there's a slight dip over the last couple of months, but clearly people are still searching for lead scoring as a topic that they're researching on. So what exactly is the goal for lead scoring anyways? And you can see some of the definitions here on the screen. But from my perspective, if I were to summarize or paraphrase, lead scoring is essentially a way or a mechanism for us to identify good leads from bad, right? And there's different ways that we can define what good looks like and what bad looks like. But I would say, by and large, those of us here in this this webinar, this event, we would probably agree lead scoring is to help us identify good from bad, right? But again, as I mentioned, I feel like we're still missing the mark somehow. And these are just some funny memes that I found on mopsmemes.com. Go check out the website. It's really funny. You'll have a good chuckle after this event if you go visit that website. But look, I've experienced this myself in my career as well, where in the past I've set up lead scoring models sort of along the lines of the image on the left. Someone opens an email or they click on a link, they go to our website, and we start racking up these points for a lead score for a particular prospect. And once they hit some sort of threshold, then we qualify them and say, there you go. This is a marketing qualified lead, MQL. And then we pass it over or toss it over the wall to our friends over in sales or an SDR or BDR. And this poor person takes that lead and tries to work it and finds out that this lead wasn't exactly qualified for whatever reason. And so they automatically disqualify it right off the bat. And, there's reports and benchmark data out there. Back in, I don't know, several years ago, I know Serious Decisions, which is the analyst firm, used to run these reports. And I remember data points that indicate something along the lines of 95 or 98% of leads that marketing generates are unqualified. I mean, these days, as I mentioned, I'm a fractional CMO / consultant. I still see those numbers in some of my clients. In fact, literally, one of my clients that I was working with, I was doing some analysis and found that their lead to close one conversion rate was right around 2%. And so there's something wrong with how we're identifying qualified leads using our current lead scoring model. So, I think we still get lead scoring wrong for a number of different reasons. In my experience of working with various clients and working in-house, here are some of the reasons that I have found to be the culprit or contributing to why lead scoring methodologies were not set up correctly. I won't go through all of them. I'll mainly going to focus on the final bullet point at the bottom, which is applying points for behaviors based on generic activities. And let me just, in one quick sentence, explain what that means. So in the past, again, I was guilty of this early on in my career, where I've set up a lead scoring model in, let's say, Marketo or a HubSpot or a Pardot that basically assigns points to a prospect's activity based off of their activity and what kind of content they consume, such as, hey, if they go and download an ebook, add 10 points, or if they join a webinar and they actually show up, give them 15 points. And if they click on certain pages, add 1 point or 5 points. And then you subtract certain points for if someone visits, let's say, a careers page, because we, for whatever reason, tend to believe that someone who looks at a careers page is not a good prospect. They're instead looking for a job. So after just thinking about this over the course of many, many years, I just feel like that's not the right approach. And we'll talk about why. Okay. And so here's the concept of the buyer journey decision process, or the buyer journey decision framework. And there's a couple of different examples that you see on the slide here. Many of us who have been in marketing or some sort of marketing role are probably aware of or have heard of the framework called AIDA, AIDA on the bottom left, which stands for awareness, interest, desire, action, or some version of that, right? And so the other ones are all kind of different variations of that. What I like to implement is the one on the upper right. I know it's a little bit fuzzy in terms of the screenshot, can't see all the details, but it's essentially a buyer journey decision framework that I borrowed or learned from Serious Decisions, which I mentioned earlier is one of the top analyst firms. They got acquired or merged with Forrester a couple of years ago. And I was fortunate enough to be a client of theirs where I picked up and learned many things along the course of my career, one of them being their buyer journey framework. And so why is that important? So let me explain this slide for a minute or two. Many companies I have found when I first joined, whether it's in-house or as a consultant, they have a pretty good idea of their products, their solutions, and the use cases that those solutions are typically used for, right? And so sometimes they use frameworks like jobs to be done, JTBD, if you are wondering what that acronym means. But by and large, many companies have a pretty good idea of their product and solutions. And maybe they even go so far as to identify what the key benefits are and the value proposition. Many companies also have the right side of the slide down to a pretty good or a certain degree, where they've done some work along the lines of identifying their target audience, their ideal customer profile, their ICP, and or maybe they've developed buyer personas, right? And so those two things are great. What I have not found to be pretty common in terms of best practice or practices in general at many of these companies that I work with is the stuff in the middle that bridges the gap between your products and solutions and your target audience. And that is really, I want to say, the holy grail for those of us in marketing and sales, even basically go-to-market teams, essentially trying to make sure we get the right message to the right people at the right time. And so why is that, right? And I'll go into this slide, but before I talk about this slide, I find a very common approach that most people take. And again, I'm not trying to slam others because I've been on the receiving end of many of these messaging myself, where let's just say I get served some sort of campaign or an email, or I get reached out to by an SDR or BDR via LinkedIn. And they all sound something similar to this, which is, hey there, Tony. My name is so-and-so. I work at this particular company, and we do this. And then they name drop maybe 3 or 4 potentially well-known customers of theirs. And then they hit me with a very salesy call to action, which is, will you take a 15-minute, 20-minute, half an hour demo or call with me? What does your schedule look like over the next couple of days? And I get that a lot. And I'm sure many of you who are joining in this presentation or listening in, you may have been on the receiving end of many of these outreach messages or marketing campaigns. And you know what? Unless I'm actually in market to buy a particular solution that's related to what you do, I don't care. No one really cares, because we're getting bombarded with these kind of messages all the time, right? And so it doesn't stand out. And so the way that I found to think about this is to introduce this, again, buyer journey decision framework or decision process framework. And one thing that I want to make sure is very clear, if you don't take away anything else from this presentation, if you only take away this one key concept, which is this: your marketing and sales funnel is different. It's a completely different thing than the buyer journey decision process. Ideally, they would be well aligned, stacked on top of each other, where your marketing and sales funnel is essentially where you think the buyer is in their decision-making process. Therefore, you've defined stages like MQL, marketing qualified lead, SAL, sales accepted lead, SQL, sales qualified lead. And again, every company has different definitions, perhaps naming conventions, but by and large, many B2B companies have these funnel stages defined, right? But don't confuse your funnel and how you define your sales cycle, as well as where you think your buyers are in the decision-making process, with where they actually are. And this is the key difference, right? If you can understand where the buyer is at, or the prospect is at in their decision-making process, then you know how to message depending on where they are in their journey. And so the 6 stages on the bottom of the slide is essentially from the serious decisions framework. I won't go through every single one, but stage one, loosening the status quo, that's about connecting the prospect to a pain point or a business issue, right? Like really highlighting the pain point that you're helping to solve for. Stage two is committing to change, which is basically communicating urgency. Why should they address that pain point now? Not 6 months from now, but today, right? And so if you communicated that well enough, at that point, you've helped convince them to commit to change, i.e., solving for that particular pain point today, which is loosening the status quo of where they live today. Then they go into the stage of exploring possible solutions where they could convince, all right, there's a pain point. I got to do something about this today, or else, something terrible is going to happen to my company or my job or my team. And therefore, I'm in the market to explore what kind of solutions are out in the market today to help me solve for this need. And then the next stage is committing to that particular solution, where they're trying to figure out, okay, is this one solution better than the alternatives out there? Moving on, justifying the decision. Hey, is it worth is it going to be worth the ROI, the return on investment? Whatever we spend on buying a solution, is it going to be worthwhile, right? And then they go through the process of making a selection. So that's the journey that by and large a lot of buyers take. All right, so again, key takeaway here, the buyer journey decision process is not the same thing as your marketing and sales funnel. So what are the steps to implement a buyer journey based scoring model, which is the focus of today's presentation? I will go into each of these steps in a little bit more detail, but as a summary, step number one, identify and define your ICP and buyer personas. In this presentation, I'm not going to walk through the process of how you go about identifying and defining your ICP and personas. If you want, contact me after this presentation is over. I could point you to some resources or perhaps send you some templates that I've used. But essentially, step number one, you got to understand your target audience and who they are, what they care about, et cetera, et cetera. Step number two, you want to create value statements aligned to each of your ICP and persona, buyer persona, their buyer journey. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like and what I mean when I say value statements. Then step number three, create or do a content audit and go through a message mapping exercise. Step number four, that's where you actually start setting up your lead scoring model. And I always advocate for at least 2 or 3 sets of scores, where the first 2 are identifying whether or not a prospect is a good fit. And then the third score is based off of activity or behavior. Many of us in marketing ops who have been doing this for a while have done it in this way. My proposal is to align my recommendation is to align the activity or behavior aspect of the lead score along the buyer journey, which is, again, well, I'll get into that. And then step number 5, which is extremely, extremely important. You got to prioritize aligning your entire revenue or go-to-market team so that they understand what these scores mean. Okay, so let's just jump into each of these steps. Okay, so this slide is a huge eyesore. There's a lot. Obviously not going to go through every single bullet point, but essentially at the top, right? If you've done a good job of identifying your ideal customer profile, and in my opinion, for B2B, your ideal customer profile is essentially the type of company that makes a company a better fit than another type of company. And again, I won't go into all the details and methodologies, but it could be characteristics along the lines of how big of a company they are, what size, how many employees, what's their revenue, annual revenue. It could be based off of a particular geography, could be certain industries or verticals. These days, many of us have access to additional data sources. And so potentially some good characteristics are what other technologies are they using. And then obviously, when you're selling, even though you may be a B2B company selling to other companies, you're still selling to people, right? And so understanding buyer personas is really important. Things like what are the job titles that match that persona? and what are their goals. Some of the most important elements to identify are obviously their pain points and challenges that they're struggling with on a day-to-day basis, right? And so this slide is an example of some work that I did for one of my clients, just for context, okay? And I'm going to walk you through this example. For context, this client is a data company, a B2B data company, and I won't reveal who they are, but they are in the same space as ZoomInfo. So if you guys are familiar with ZoomInfo, this company, a client of mine, operates in the same space. And so in this example, their target persona is a sales leader, perhaps a CRO or an SVP of sales. And you could see, the type of companies that they typically sell to. And let me just zoom in for a second on the bottom left, where let's focus on the early buyer journey. The value statements, what I mean by value statements is that they are the key thoughts that you want to instill or impart in this persona in that particular stage. And the goal is to message against that value statements. And the idea, the whole idea is to reinforce the messaging along those value statements where you're bringing them from that one stage to the next. Here's an example, okay? So if you recall, sales leader could be a CRO, could be an SVP of sales as a target persona. If that person is in the loosening the status quo stage, and we could just assume almost everyone is on that stage if you're starting to reach out to prospects, right? And we could talk about later on how to identify people and figure out where they are in the buyer journey. But if we just start here, loosening status quo, what that means is connecting the sales leader to a pain point or business issue that keeps them up at night. All right. So the value statement for this person could be, hey, I'm a CRO, right? My team spends a lot of time trying to find phone numbers and navigating through company phone trees because they're trying to do some outbounds. They're trying to cold call and connect to potential clients, right? My wish as a sales leader is that my team can be more productive and focus on actually, revenue generating activities rather than manual or menial tasks such as dialing into a company phone tree, trying to find and navigate to find the right person, and that could potentially take, 5 minutes, 10 minutes of my time, of that sales rep's time, right? And so if you can convince them of that as a pain point, there's another layer. And again, this is just a summary, but the layer behind that that's value statement is if my team is not focused on activities that generate revenue and they're wasting a lot of time, that's going to impact my entire sales organization's capability of hitting quota. And that kind of leads into stage number 2, committing the change, where if this person is convinced that there's a pain point to be solved for, this number 2 is about urgency. If my team cannot be more efficient, we will have a higher chance of missing our quota. And if I or we consistently miss quota, either my team or I myself will get fired, right? You could tell, like that's connecting the pain point directly to the sales leader and instilling a sense of urgency, right? And so again, the whole idea is to message and hit upon these value statements, which are the key points that you want to leave this person with to guide them down that decision-making process. Oh, and by the way, let me just go backwards in a slide. At the very bottom, you can see the categories of the why, the what, and the how. Again, the earlier example that I've shared where I was on the receiving end of many of these very generic messaging, such as, hey, my name's so-and-so, I work on this with this company, we do this. That's really much focused on the what, right? If I'm not convinced about the why, I don't care about the what. And so again, that's another way of looking at the buyer journey. Start with the why, talk about the pain point, connect the prospect to the pain point or the business issue, and connect them to the level of urgency that they need to solve for this pain point today. Once they have been convinced of that, that's when they're more receptive to the what. And then later on, the how is how you're differentiated. How do you actually solve and meet for those needs, right? Let's take a step back. lot of my colleagues in the B2B marketing space and even the sales space, we talk about demand creation and demand capture. So, in my opinion, demand creation is about getting the prospect to realize that there is an urgent pain or challenge that they need to solve for today, right? And if you look in the context of the buyer journey, it's around the first one, two, yeah, I guess you could say two stages of the buyer journey, or very early buyer journey. Demand capture is about getting the prospect to realize that your solution can solve or meet that pain or challenge better than any of the alternatives out in the market today. That's where the prospect is in the middle of the buyer journey, right? Notice that I did use specifically language that's where I say early buyer journey and middle buyer journey, not top of the funnel and middle of the funnel, because again, it's really about where the buyer is in terms of their decision making process. All right, and so the goal then of lead scoring is therefore to help you identify where a great fit prospect is in their buyer journey. Great fit being one aspect. If you recall my earlier slide, I had recommended breaking it out to fit in the fit score being company, ICP fit, persona fit, and then where they are in the buyer journey. This is where the activity or behavioral score comes into play, right? So goal of lead scoring is to identify where the prospect is, if it's a great prospect, where they are in the buyer journey. All right, so I could hear people asking out loud, talking to the screen, but wait, Tony, what about MQLs, marketing qualified leads, right? Well, I'm glad you asked. Okay, so on this slide, remember, I had mentioned early on in this presentation that your marketing and sales funnel and the buyer journey process are two different things. The goal for us is to make sure that they're as well aligned as possible, right? And this is how I found how to accomplish that. Essentially, align your definitions to the buyer journey decision process. So typically in the past, how I've done it is to define an MQL to when someone has been convinced of loosening a status quo and committing to change, meaning they've been served content or they have consumed content that gives me an indication that their status quo is loosened, or in other words, the business issue or pain point have been well communicated to that person, and that they've been committing, they're in a state where they're committed to change, that there's urgency communicated to them, and they realize that, right? At that point, that's where I define an MQL, marketing qualified lead. Okay, now I'm going to go into how we actually accomplish that. There's an interim step here, which is doing a content audit and asset mapping. And in a second, you'll understand why. Okay, so after I have gone through the exercise of defining your the ideal customer profile and the persona, where we have a pretty good idea of the pain point that they're experiencing that you could potentially help solve for. And then we have identified all the key value statements. There could be multiple value statements per ICP, persona, and per stage of the buyer journey. Once we've done that, what I would typically do at that point is to do a content audit where I go through all the content and assets that we have already published, whether it's on our website or we're promoting them, or whether it's through ads or through email, we're sending out emails to drive people towards certain assets. Essentially, all the content that we have available that we're serving up or exposing our prospects to. And then in a spreadsheet, you can see on the screenshot here on the left, I just put in a Google Sheet, but I catalog all the content pieces, and I put in some metadata, like what kind of content type. And again, in the past, and I've been guilty of this myself, I typically just jump right into the lead scoring and say, all right, for a blog post, add 5 points. And if it's a webinar, add 15 points, thinking, looking in hindsight, erroneously, that a webinar is worth more than a blog. And I align my scoring that way. Well, what I'm suggesting is, first of all, let's identify all your content pieces, align it towards a particular persona and ICP that it's meant to speak to, And then in the screen shot on the left, where on the Google sheet, column N on the right of that screenshot, I align the content piece to a buyer journey stage. And you don't see this here, but on a further column to the right, I actually have another column where I'm assessing how well this particular content piece is aligned towards a value statement or reinforcing a value statement for that buyer journey stage. Okay. The rule that I always apply to either myself if I'm doing this or if I'm working with an internal team, the rule that I impart to them and say, look, a particular piece of content can speak to multiple personas and multiple ICPs, but it could only fall under one of the buyer journey stages. In this example, we basically combine buyer journey stage 1 and 2 together, 3 and 4 together, 5 and 6 together, just to simplify things just a tiny bit. In the framework I use, as you saw, 6 stages, but we just combine first 2, middle 2, and last 2 together, okay? And so the rule is it can only fit into one of these categories, all right? And once I've done this audit and cataloging all the assets and content that we have available, I then run a quick pivot table, or if you guys are familiar with how to set up a pivot table, basically it helps me understand all the content that we've cataloged, who do they speak to, and what, how many pieces of content do we have for each persona and for each buyer journey stage, which is the bottom right screenshot, right? And so that does a number of things right off the bat. Number one, it gives me an idea of where our content gaps are, right? It gives direction to our, if we have an internal content team, we tell them, look, all right, in this example, if we're trying to sell the sales leader, we only have 4 pieces of content for buyer journey stages 5 and 6. Can you guys go and develop more content to reinforce the value statements for those 2 stages? Great, because guess what? Our sales reps, our account executives that are working on deals, they're going to need those assets to help them close deals, right? And so number one, it gives us a really good idea of what content that we need to produce, and it gives great direction to content teams, because sometimes they struggle with, all right, well, what kind of content do we want to produce? They're trying to rack their brains for creative ideas. Here's a great way to identify gaps in content. Number 2, and this is a total side benefit, this automatically identifies the content that you could utilize to create your email nurture program, right? If you have personas that are identified in the early buyer journey stage, well, guess what? For my sales leader, I've got 24 pieces of content that are well aligned towards the buyer journey stage. I could use all 24. That might be overkill, but it helps me already figure out what kind of content I can use for email nurture programs, right? Okay, so valuable, extremely valuable exercise. Now, how do we utilize this for lead scoring? Setting it up, right? The first part is I want to create an activity-based lead score for each part of the buyer journey. Again, for my most recent clients, I just advocate to set up 3 different activity-based scores: buyer journey 1, 2, buyer journey 3, 4, and then buyer journey 5, 6. I set up as 3 different data fields to score for these behaviors, and it's all just pure behavior-based scores. Then I work with the team to tag each of those content pieces. Typically, they're hosted on the website, right? And I tag each of these content pieces to align towards a buyer journey. And how that's typically plays out, if you don't have some sort of content, management tool, content management system, document management. I'm not talking about CMS in terms of website. I mean, I've worked with, WordPress or whatever CMS website tool. Essentially, it's just adding a tag to the URL that says something like -BJ12. And that to me is a way to tag a particular piece of content that's hosted on our website as buyer journey stages 1 and 2, right? And so once you've identified and tagged each of your key content pieces to a buyer journey stage, then you apply the scoring for that particular piece of content, but you're applying the score for the messaging, not on the format or the medium like I described. So instead of adding 5 points to a blog post and 10 points to webinar, you know, the point isn't the delivery vehicle necessary. It's around the messaging. And so what I would suggest, you can see on a screenshot where this is HubSpot, right? We're adding a certain number of points for content, 5 points here, that have been identified as buyer journey 1, 2. Okay, and so that will increase the buyer journey activity score by 5 points, depending on how many times they accumulated content or consumed the content. And then I always recommend applying a scoring decay methodology to your lead scores, because you don't want scores to keep building up over time, over the course of, let's say, a year or 2 years, if you have a short sales cycle, because I want to understand recency. Okay, so that's high level steps of how you set it up. Again, the screenshot on the right's in HubSpot. It'll look slightly different, obviously, for Marketo and Pardot or Eloqua, Oracle Marketing Cloud, or whatever marketing automation tool you use. But the point is, you add scoring, behavior score, aligned to a content that reinforces messaging, not the fact that it's a blog post or a webinar. Okay, then how I set it up, the next step is to define what an MQL is. And again, I won't go through every single thing on the slide, but to me, an MQL should be a signal or a proxy that a prospect has been educated enough for their status quo to be challenged, buyer journey stage 1, and that they're ready to commit to change, status quo, buyer journey stage 2. And so by consuming the amount of content, we are then aligning the definition of an MQL along the lines of the number of content that they've consumed that reinforces the value statements of those 2 stages. That's it, right? And again, this is going to be equal parts art and science, unless you have some sort of predictive lead scoring tool in place, but you'll have to make adjustments. The key takeaway, again, is to align the scoring methodology to the actual content and the context of the content to reinforce those value statements. That's how you would want to set up your MQL definitions. All right, very last step. This is extremely important. Obviously, you want to document everything. And then, you know, if you're working with a CRM system where the rest of your revenue teams potentially live, you want to make sure that there are certain things that are visible in their page view layouts, right? So that they can see, all right, this particular prospect has this amount of points for buyer journey stages, you know, 1, 2, whatever, right? You got to do a number of multiple training sessions. You can't just simply, you know, show them this video, record your own, and then just consider it done. It's a iterative process, right? You got to get feedback and fine tune over time. But the only way for this to be successful is that you and the rest of the go-to-market and revenue teams, from marketing to SDRs to AEs, to sometimes even your customer success, they all understand and have buy-in on this new way of looking at scoring in the buyer journey. Okay. Now, once you do that, you could get really advanced and do some really interesting things. And so the screenshot that you see is a screenshot from a Salesforce instance from one of the companies I used to work with in-house, where we did roll-ups. I rolled up the number of target personas for a particular account, right? So that screenshot is a Salesforce view of all the target accounts that a particular sales rep is working on. And then in one of the columns, the first arrow on the left shows the number of people that we have identified. And then the next one is around total behavior, the second arrow. This is basically a roll up of all the behavior scores or activity scores, buyer journey scores, summed up for that account. The purpose of that is so that I can understand how many people are we engaged with at a particular account, and how well that they've been educated, these groups of people along the buyer journey, right? And so it gives me a quick glance. And then the one on the right gives me an idea of how many people are actually engaged. Of the 50 people that we know within our systems, we had lead to account matching, right? It shows that 11 people were engaged with us, and those 11 people accumulated a total of 1,600 total behavior points, which is, you know, quite a bit. That to me tells me those 11 people are really engaged, right? So you get really advanced with how you utilize these scoring methodologies, all right? But again, crawl, walk, run, got to get the basics down. Okay, so I know we went pretty long. As a recap, step number one, you got to identify and define your ICP and buyer personas. Step number two, you got to create these value statements to identify what are the key thoughts you want to instill for each of your buyers, your buyer personas along each of the buyer journeys. Whatever framework you decide to use, you choose to use ADA, that's fine. I just happen to like the Forrester, I guess you could say Forrester, the Serious Decisions 6-stage model. I like that because it's much prescriptive, but you want to be very prescriptive with the kind of messaging to guide your buyers down the buyer journey. Then step number three, do a content audit and messaging mapping exercise. Step number four, this is where you start setting it up in your marketing automation platform. The key takeaway there is to align your scoring along content that serves or reinforces a particular value statement for a buyer journey. And then step number five, make sure that you loop in the rest of your go-to-market teams, your revenue teams, so everybody has buy-in and that they're educated on what these scores mean and understand the buyer journey framework. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Again, I know I covered a lot. Feel free to email me if you have questions. I mentioned early on that if you do want to get access to certain templates and examples that I've used throughout my career, I'm more than happy to share. Just shoot me an email at tony@revoptica.com. Thanks so much. Hope that was helpful. And yeah, best of luck to you. Hey everyone, I hope you guys found that to be super helpful and I hope you learned something. We have about 8 minutes left for Q&A, so go ahead and get your questions in. I believe we already had a few come in. I'll start addressing them in order. So the first one that I'll address is from Bianca. Hey Bianca, good to see you. Her question is, who would company stakeholders be to start conversations about creating a buyer journey? So that's a fantastic question. I mentioned how important it was to do that as the final step, which is to make sure we get buy-in. Essentially, the short answer to that question is pretty much your entire go-to-market team, your revenue team. Now, let me, that's kind of I don't want to say tongue-in-cheek answer, but here's the reason why. You can't create a scoring model without getting input from, especially, let's just say your salespeople, SDR, sales reps, account executives, even your customer success, because let's face it, many times for us in marketing, we're not as close to the customers as the teams that I just mentioned, customer success, sales, etc. And so it's super important as you're going about creating the buyer journey framework to get that input. Without going into all the details, the typical steps I go about this is when I start creating and identifying the pain points, personas, and then the value statements, I actually do several working sessions with each stakeholder team, the SDRs, the AEs, the customer success, and get their input. That's to get their feedback. And then once I start creating these value statements and then formulate a lead scoring model, I go back and say, hey, look, this is what we have in mind, right? And the reason why we're having a lead scoring model is to help identify the best fit leads and the most ready leads aligned to the buyer journey. And once we connect the dots for them back to the reasons why we're doing this and also what the score is meant to represent, so that it's not just a random number, then they get it. And then they will understand, all right, this is what this score means. And so, again, I don't mean to be flippant about the answer, but really, truly, I think implementing any sort of lead scoring methodology requires getting buy-in through, your entire go-to-market team. And I wouldn't just limit it to just the leaders, CRO or head of customer success. Yes, definitely get them involved, but you want to talk to the people who are actually going to be utilizing and taking advantage of these scores and the buyer journeys. So great question. All right. Let's see. Second question comes from Petra, and it looks like Jen is also interested in this question, which is, um, should we have, I'm paraphrasing here, different scoring models for different territories, such as North America region versus EMEA? I would say yes, if the personas and ICPs look different for each of these regions. And if they do, then the buyer journey stages and the value statements have to be aligned towards the personas and ICP. Now, the nuances are found in the actual ICP and the persona. And I would even say, as an example, specifically within personas, I've worked at companies that were, as I mentioned before, global, and so we had people in EMEA, we had people in South America and different markets, right? And so even though they may have those different markets may have the same general ICP in terms of the types of company, the personas in that particular example look kind of different, down to different job titles. Now, job titles and personas aren't always one-to-one, right? And so that's why there's a difference between an actual job title and how we define a persona. But even more specifically, how certain people or certain personas in a particular region talk about the pain points or struggles or challenges may be verbalized in a different way than in another market. And that's really important because part of the value statement exercise or developing these value statements to align your content revolves or involves understanding how to communicate things like, the pain point. And, the whole goal is to make sure that the ICP, the pain point that you're highlighting resonates with them. And so a lot of times it has to do not just, the actual language, but how they actually talk about it in terms of the terminology. So I would say, yes, definitely consider different scoring models for different regions, especially if the buyer persona and ICPs look different across each of the regions. So great question. Okay, so let's see. Aiden had another question. Looked like Aiden was wondering about the ABC in step 4, which is triggering an MQL. So we don't have the slides up. I'll have to kind of remember and let me know if this is not what your question is. But when I implement a lead scoring model, I have at least 3 different factors. One, whether it's an ICP fit as determined by the type of company. And there's different type of company criteria that I look for depending on, the market that we're trying to sell into. The persona fit, if it's the right person, and then the behavior side of the score, which includes all the content consumption aligned towards value statements in the buyer journey. Because you could certainly have a great fit company, but the person that came in or is engaged with you is not the right person, or vice versa. The person might be the right persona, but might not necessarily be the right company or ICP fit. You always want to identify the fit score. And then the buyer journey is around, the content that they consume that guides them along the buyer journey decision framework. And we're using the lead score, the behavior score, to align towards a particular stage. So I use A, B, and C as a letter score to determine the fit side. And then I generally just use a number score for the behavior side, the content consumption. And then one last point about that, I actually, for the most part, I like to have 3 different behavior scores, number-based scores based off of early buyer journey, buyer journey stage 1 and 2, mid buyer journey, stages 3 and 4, and late buyer journey, stages 5 and 6. And I like to keep track of, content that they consume along those journey stages. Okay, quick question by Catherine around what am I using for lead to account matching? So that's a very important and often overlooked capability that is required, especially for account-based marketing. We won't go into all the details because there's not enough time, but I'm a firm believer that you need to have lead to account matching if you're using in Salesforce the lead object in conjunction with the contact object. We won't go into all the details around that. I've used tools like Lean Data in the past. I've used other tools. I'm sorry, I forget the name. but there are other tools out there. There's a handful of tools that if you simply ask the community, they'll I'm sure people will give you an idea. There's also homegrown built-in logic that if you have someone who's really good with Salesforce, they can implement. Okay, so let me just address one more from Vivian. It's a pretty long question, but let me address the last one. Vivian is asking, to determine the proper persona fit, do you collect role in company and industry on lead forms? Okay, so I would say if you have to, then yes. Now, this goes into a longer discussion on what you want to gate and ungate and present in front of a prospect. The short answer that I will give is these days, there are plenty of technology tools, data vendor providers out there who offer data enrichment services that integrate with your marketing automation or CRM, where if a lead comes in and you're simply asking for, let's just say, name, company name, and job title and email, or maybe not even job title, but let's say email, they have the capability to match and enrich that data on the back end. So the benefit of these solutions are you don't have to go and ask 8, 10, 15 different fields on a form to gather information. You could just ask for certain ones, and then a data enrichment provider will fill that in. Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you again. I hope you guys found my session to be helpful. Stick around for the next session. This event has a ton of great content, so I highly encourage you guys to stick around, attend the rest of today's sessions, tomorrow's sessions. There's a lot of stuff going on. Again, best of luck to you. Reach out to me if you guys have additional questions. Thanks. Take care.